He is a prominent commentator on the role of mathematics and science in society, regularly writing for The Guardian and The Independent, and a range of other media outlets. He regularly appears on radio shows like BBC's More or Less and Inside Science, as well as TV news shows and documentaries. It is also one of the core scientists that forms Independent SAGE, providing independent scientific advice to policymakers and the public on COVID throughout the pandemic. So I'll hand you over to Kit for the talk.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for turning up and coming to listen. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my second book, which is called How to Expect the Unexpected, which is about predicting the future. But before, I think I need to re-click on the slide to make sure the clicker works. Before we get there, I often do this, or a similar version of this talk for school children. I can see we've got some older school children in, but it's still quite a fun section. It's about predicting the future. So what's going to happen is I'm going to give you a school report from someone famous that you'll know, and you have to guess who that person is. And the spoiler alert is that most of these predictions were incorrect. So here's the first one. This one's about physical education. He must devote less of his time to sport if he wants to be a success. You can't make a living out of football. Any ideas? Feel free to shout out. It's not Beckham. It is Gary Lineker, the BBC's most well-paid commentator of any description, not just in sport, although not anymore because he's left now. What about this one? This is English. A persistent muddler, vocabulary negligible, sentences malconstructed. He reminds me of a camel. Any ideas? Boris Johnson is not. Everyone guesses Boris Johnson for this one, and it is completely understandable that you did that. Any other ideas?
David Attenborough.
David Attenborough. No, it's not. It's a good guess there. No, it's not. I'll tell you, this one is a bit harder. This one is Roald Dahl. The reason why I think this is such a beautiful one is because, apart from the fact that he became a very famous author, famous for writing, and famous for being good at English, but he also had this streak, especially in his children's book, of using what he called gobblefunk, this sort of made-up language. The BFG talks about snoscumbers and frobscottle and struggles for his words. And this actually predicts very accurately what he ended up doing. And the story behind that is that he was married to the actress Patricia Neal, and she suffered brain injury, which meant that she couldn't speak. And so he had to effectively teach her how to speak again. And when she was in hospital recovering, he would go and try and make her learn her words. But she sometimes just couldn't grasp the words, so she would reach for some other word and just make it up. And apparently that inspired him to use this gobblefunk in many of his books. So the astute amongst you will notice that the original picture I showed there is not actually Roald Dahl. That's Hugh Bonneville playing Roald Dahl in a recent biopic, and this is the real Roald Dahl. Okay, here's another one. Science. He'll never amount to anything. Any ideas? It's not. It's Einstein. Yeah, it's Einstein. Of course, it is the most famous scientist of all. And again, the astute amongst you will notice that this is not actually Einstein. This is Geoffrey Rush playing Einstein in a recent biopic. Okay, last one. Not very good. He spends a good deal of time, apparently, in investigations in advanced mathematics to the neglect of his elementary work. A sound groundwork is essential in any subject, and this is the kicker at the end. This is really what gets me about this report. His work is dirty. This is maths. Anyone, any ideas of who this is? Not me. It's kind of you to suggest that. It's not me. Any other ideas?
Stephen Hawking.
It's not Hawking. It's a good shout, though. Any other famous mathematicians we can think of? They're not that many. It's not Marcus. Yeah, someone said Alan Turing. Absolutely. Alan Matheson Turing. And the astute amongst you will notice that this is not actually Alan Turing. This is, of course, Sherlock Holmes. Sorry, this is, of course, Benedict Cumberbatch playing Alan Turing in a recent biopic. Yes, so that's Alan Turing, my mathematical hero, known for his advances in artificial intelligence, his code breaking during the war, but also lesser known, but still famous for mathematical biology, which is my own subject area. He wrote a very influential paper in 1952 called On the Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, which in which he described what's called reaction diffusion patterning. It describes the way that the leopard gets its spots, if you like. So a very famous paper in our field, and he's considered one of the fathers of our field. So much so that when I was last in Manchester, I went and took a selfie with the statue of Alan Turing, which sits in a park in Sackville Park in Manchester. And quite poignantly, he's holding an apple in his hand. And this is a nod to the appalling treatment that Alan Turing received back in the 1950s. He was a gay man at a time when homosexual acts were illegal in the UK, and he was arrested and he was given a choice between going to prison and chemical castration, so being injected with estrogen. And he chose the latter, but it had a terrible effect on his psyche, on his psychology. It sent him into deep depression. And one of his favourite films was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and in that the witch dips the apple in poison and gives it to Snow White. And so Turing, when he killed himself in 1954, he laced an apple with cyanide and ate the apple. So it's a sort of poignant nod to the fact that we were robbed of one of our greatest mathematicians at a very, very early age. So yeah, real tragedy. I like to think that Alan Turing, living in Manchester, would have been a Man City fan like me, but we don't know who his allegiances lay with, unfortunately. When I took this photo, a few people in the park looked at me very strangely because I was taking a selfie with a statue, and I stood up and I saw them looking at me. I said, "Don't worry, it's fine. I'm a mathematician," as if somehow that would explain. They didn't know who he was, so somehow this would explain why I was taking a selfie with the statue. Anyway, so that's the school report. So the point of that section is, when I'm talking to school children in particular, is to say that you shouldn't let other people's opinions of what your future is going to be define your future. And sometimes our school teachers, although we trust them, we respect them, but sometimes we give them too much respect for their predictions into the future when they maybe don't have the best idea of what we're going to go on and do. So what I want to say to people is, just because you've been told that you weren't good at maths at school, that doesn't mean you can't go on to have a career that is mathematical, or just to enjoy recreational mathematics, or to do mathematics in your everyday life and to use it where it's important. Okay, so that's sort of a bit of a preface to what's going on. I want to tell you a bit about the book. There are two main messages in the book, and these messages are non-linearity and randomness. Two things where I think we make mistakes when we're predicting the future, when we're trying to understand the world around us: non-linearity and randomness. So the talk will be broken into two parts, and the first will be about non-linearity. Now, I've said non-linearity 4 times already, and I haven't yet told you what it is, so I should start by telling you what it is. But to tell you what it is, I first need to tell you what it isn't, if you like. I need to tell you what linearity is before we start talking about non-linearity. So linearity is a relationship between two variables, an input and an output, where a fixed change in the input gives you a fixed change in the output. So that sounds a little bit technical, but really all it means is that when you draw a linear relationship on a graph, you draw it as a straight line. That's why it's called linear. So to give you an example, if I want to convert pounds into New Zealand dollars, the exchange rate's about 2 to 1. So for every pound, I get 2 New Zealand dollars back. When I draw that relationship on a graph with the number of pounds on this horizontal x-axis, the number of dollars I get back on this vertical y-axis, then it's just a straight line. Okay, so when I change £20, I should get back $40, 2 for 1. And the point of a linear relationship is whenever I increase by a fixed amount the input, so by £20, say, I should increase the output by a fixed amount, so in this case, $40. And it doesn't matter where I start on that graph, whenever I increase by a fixed amount by another £20, I always increase the output by a fixed amount, again by another $40. So that's the essence of a linear relationship. This particular relationship is a special type of linear relationship. It's called direct proportion. You might have heard that term before. And what that means is that when I double the input, I also double the output. So when I double the input from £20 to £40, I double the output from $40 to $80. And they're directly proportional relationships are straight lines, but they also go through this special point at the bottom, the origin, 0, 0. Okay, so that's a directly proportional relationship, but not every linear relationship is in direct proportion. Okay, you can have linear relationships which are not in direct proportion. So to give you an example, temperature. There are two temperature scales that we use around the world. And when I say we use around the world, I mean everyone uses Celsius except the Americans. They use Fahrenheit, okay? But we have to be able to talk to our American cousins in scientific terms. So we need to be able to convert between Celsius and Fahrenheit. And this is what the relationship looks like when you draw it on a graph. And the mathematical formula would be you take the Celsius temperature, you multiply it by 1.8, and then you add 32. So 0 degrees Celsius is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's probably quite well known. If I add on 10 degrees Celsius, so it gets to 10 degrees Celsius, then I multiply that by 1.8, I get 18, add on 32, and it's 50 Fahrenheit. And again, the point of this linear relationship is wherever I start, if I give a fixed change in the temperature in Celsius, the input, by another 10 degrees, then I should change the output by 18 degrees. Okay, so it's 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And then again, if I increase by a fixed amount by another 10 degrees, I increase the output by another 18 degrees. So that's the essence of a linear relationship. Now, I have massively overemphasized linear relationship. I could have just said, well, when you draw it on a graph, it's a straight line. You probably all would have understood what I was talking about. But that is sort of the point of linear relationships, and why they're so pernicious is because we are taught from our very earliest days in school that relationships are linear. This is the implicit assumption we're expected to make when we're answering maths problems. So here's a sort of maths problem that my son might be doing at school. If Jane pays £5 for 10 grapefruits, how many grapefruits does she get for £50? Does anyone want to have a go at this? Yeah, someone said it 100. Absolutely. So she pays 10 times as much, and she should get 10 times as many grapefruits. It's a directly proportional relationship. So the linear answer is 100 grapefruits. But no one at school stops to think, what the hell is Jane going to do with 100 grapefruits when she gets home? How's she going to carry them home, right? And actually, probably more to the point, when you buy 100 grapefruits, you probably don't pay the same price as you do for 10 grapefruits. You probably get a discount because you're going down to the cash and carry, or you know, there's a 3 for 2 deal going on. It's not a linear relationship, okay? But we are taught to assume this is the way you answer that question because we're not told anything else about it. So that's what we have to assume. So psychologists have realized this. They understand that we have this over-reliance on linearity, and they try to write what are called pseudo-linearity questions to try to trick us into using linearity when linearity is not the correct thing for us to be using. So I'm going to show you a few examples of pseudo-linearity questions. So here's one. Laura is a sprinter. Her best time to run 100 meters is 13 seconds. How long will it take her to run a kilometer? Okay, so the linear answer is, well, a kilometer is 10 times as far as 100 meters. So it should take her 10 times as long. It should take her 130 seconds, which is 2 minutes and 10 seconds. That's the linear answer. But this guy, he doesn't like that answer. This guy's Noah Ngeni. He is the world record holder for the kilometer. And do you know what his world record kilometer time is? 2 minutes and 11 seconds. So by suggesting that Laura can keep up her best 100 meters pace, which, by the way, 13 seconds for 100 meters is pretty fast. But by suggesting that she can keep that up for a whole kilometer, we are saying that Laura is going to break the world record for the kilometer. And we know that running over distance is not a linear relationship, right? You can't keep up your best 100 meter pace. You slow down the further you go. So that's a nice example of a pseudo-linearity problem. Here's another one. If it takes 3 towels 3 hours to dry on the line, how long does it take 9 towels to dry? People are laughing, which is good. But if you ask this to ChatGPT, like I did, then this is the answer that you might get. If it takes 3 hours for 3 towels to dry, then it would take 9 hours for 9 towels to dry. This is because the drying time is directly proportional to the number of towels, apparently. If you double the number of towels, you double the amount of time it takes for them to dry, which is clearly nonsense, right? We all know that if your washing line is big enough, then it shouldn't take any longer for 9 towels to dry than it does for 3 towels to dry. Now, I did this last minute or so of the talk at the Royal Institution when I was launching this book, and they clipped it up and they put it on social media, and it went viral. It was actually their most viewed video of all time. It's got 13 million views because people love seeing ChatGPT getting things wrong. And I'm not saying that I had any influence on this, but now when you ask ChatGPT this question, it does get it right. So I'm shamed into correcting it. I don't know. Okay, so that's another pseudo-linearity problem. What about this one? Farmer Jones takes 1 hour to mow a square field with sides of length 100 meters. How long would it take her to mow a square field with sides of length 300 meters? So the classic trap we're expected to fall into is, well, 300 meters is 3 times as long as 100 meters. And so it should take 3 times as long. It should take 3 hours. That's the classic linear answer. But of course, when you're mowing a field, what's important is not the length of the sides of the field, or only insofar as they determine the area of the field. Okay, and so if you triple the length of the sides of a square field, then you should increase the area by a factor of 9. So it should take 9 times as long to mow the square field that has sides which are 3 times as long, all things being equal. Okay, so so that's another example, and that's an example of where of area, and area is, area doesn't vary linearly with length. Okay, so in particular you can see this in pizzas. Okay, so here's a question about pizza. If you want to maximize your value for money, is it better to order 2 8-inch diameter pizzas for £10 each, or is it best to order 1 16-inch diameter pizza for £20? And so on the face of it, the linear argument goes, well, if I buy 2 8-inch diameter pizzas, I put them next to each other, then I've got 16 inches in diameter in total, and that costs £20. And then I can get 1 16-inch diameter pizza for £20. So the linear answer doesn't really matter, right? Because I've got the same length of pizza. But of course, when we're eating pizza, no one cares about the length of pizzas when you stack them back to back, do they? People care about the area of the pizza. So actually, if this is your 16-inch diameter pizza, this is your 2 8-inch diameter pizzas on top of it. But actually, to get the same area, you need 4 of those 8-inch diameter pizzas in order to make the same area as the 16-inch diameter pizza, which would cost you £40 instead of £20. So I presupposed here, you need to call me out on this if you see this, I presupposed that the price of the pizza scales linearly with the diameter, right? So an 8-inch pizza was £10 and a 16-inch pizza was £20. That's a linear relationship. So I should really provide you with evidence that that is the case. And so if you were so inclined, you could test out the prices of pizzas at 3,500 different pizza restaurants, 7,500 different pizzas in total, and you could plot them on a graph and you would see that they look like this. And so you can see, okay, it's a bit noisy as you'd expect, but roughly, indeed, the price of the pizza does scale roughly linearly with the diameter, and it's actually almost in direct proportion. It's roughly $8 for an 8-inch pizza and about $30 for a 30-inch pizza, not quite, but nearly in direct proportion. So indeed, the price does scale linearly with the diameter. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, remember the lesson of the pizza is that you should always buy the biggest pizza that you can, which meets the needs of the people eating that pizza, because that will give you the best value for money. And that seems to be the lesson that most people do take away from this talk. So that's fine. If that's all that we get out of tonight, then that's absolutely fine. If you're going by a pizza shop on the way home, then remember this. Good. The other place where we see nonlinear relationships, or one of the other places that I talk about in the book, there are lots of other nonlinear relationships, but one of them is in positive feedback loops. So the place we'll probably most likely have encountered a positive feedback loop where the output of a process feeds back into the input and amplifies or can degrade that process. Probably most likely to have experienced this in audio feedback, right? So acoustic feedback. So if you get too close to if the amplifier is too close to the microphone, then the microphone picks up the noise that's coming out of the amplifier and then sends it back to the amplifier, and it gets amplified, and then that goes to the microphone again and it gets amplified again. And in particular, depends on the type of amplifier and microphone setup you've got, but it tends to be really high frequency pitches that get amplified the most. It can happen with lower frequencies as well, depending on the audio setup. But we tend to get that sort of screechy sound, which makes people put their fingers in their ears. It's incredibly unpleasant. That is a result of a positive feedback loop. The output is feeding back into the input and amplifying that process. Now, you can use it constructively. So people like Jimi Hendrix, much of his music is synonymous with acoustic feedback, and many people like his music. But it can work to our detriment. Another place where we see it is in the stock market. So you can imagine a situation where a company does well one day, maybe it gets a good set of results, and then that means that the share price goes up for that company. And then people on the outside who are thinking of investing think, oh, well, that share price is going up, I'm going to have a bit of that while we're in at the bottom. And so they want to buy shares, and so the sellers can ask for a higher price because the demand is outstripping the supply of those shares. So they can ask for a higher price and the share price goes up again. And then more people see this meteoric rise of this stock price and say, oh, I'd like to get a bit of that again. And so again, the demand is outstripping the supply and the sellers can ask for a higher price. And so you can get into this positive feedback loop where the price of the stock or the share becomes completely devoid from the actual quality of the company that those shares are representing. And of course, this happened in the early 2000s and late 90s with the dot-com boom. There were companies who had literally just registered their name as .com. They'd never posted a profit. They'd hardly even posted accounts, and people were investing in them because they had this .com name. There was this sort of confidence process, and exactly this happened. The prices of these companies spiraled way out of proportion to what these companies were actually worth. And actually, unfortunately, any good financial advisor will tell you that a positive feedback loop can make the price of your shares go down as well as up. Okay, so we think that positive means it's always going to be increasing, but actually positive feedback loops can make things decrease as well. It works in the opposite way. So this is exactly what happened in the dot-com boom, the dot-com bubble. It burst, right? People lost confidence. So imagine the situation, the share price dips one day, and then suddenly investors think, well, I need to get out of this company before it drops any further. So they sell their shares. So the market gets flooded. And this time it's a buyer's market, so the buyer can ask for a lower price, and the share price drops when those shares get sold. And so again, people think, oh, the share price has dropped even further. I need to sell my shares, and the market gets further and further flooded. The buyers can ask for a lower and lower price, and the share price can go down. That's also a positive feedback loop, but working in the opposite direction. Okay, so financial, it's really important from a financial point of view to understand this. One of the most important areas and the reason why scientists are so worried about global warming is precisely because of these sorts of feedback loops. So one of the feedback loops I'll tell you about is called the ice albedo feedback. Okay, so the albedo is the amount of radiation that's incident on the Earth that gets reflected back. And we know that white surfaces like ice are better at reflecting solar radiation than dark surfaces like land or the sea. So what happens is if we produce just a little bit of global warming, anthropogenic, human-created global warming, and we melt some of the ice, then that reduces the Earth's albedo. There's more of the dark surface to absorb the heat and less of the light surface to reflect it. So the temperature goes up, melts more ice, which creates the same problem, right? We get less ice to reflect back and more dark surface to absorb the solar radiation. There are lots of other feedback loops that are going on with global warming, ice melting and freeing microbes, which then create carbon dioxide and so on. But this is the reason why scientists are worried by what seem like relatively small rises in temperature, right? So 1.5 degrees, 2.5 degrees. Maybe many of us would be like, oh, that'd be nice if my back garden was a bit warmer in winter, that'd be quite pleasant. But of course, these things can get out of control, and it also means that we're going to get unpredictable weather, more extremes of temperature. So that's why scientists are so concerned about what might seem like relatively small rises in temperature caused by humans, because they have the potential to get out of control with these feedback loops. And one place where we will no doubt all have experienced the positive feedback loop in the last 5 years is in epidemics and indeed in pandemics. So at the early stages of an epidemic, you'll know that there was this, probably remember from the news, that there was this number called the R number. Right, the R number is called the reproduction number. That's what R stands for. And it tells you the number of newly infected people that each infectious person will pass the disease on to. So the strain of COVID that came out of Wuhan had an R number of 3. So that means that each newly infected person will go on and infect 3 other people. We call it R0 because the 0 represents the time at the start of the epidemic. That's what the 0 stands for. So the basic reproduction number, as it's known, in this case was 3. So the first person infects 3 other people, they go and infect 3 other people, and you can see how this is already going to spiral out of control. Okay, so this is the initial growth of an epidemic being subject to a positive feedback loop, and it's a very special type of positive feedback loop, which is called exponential growth. Okay, so again, the term will probably be familiar to you, but we hear about exponential processes often in the news. But actually, exponential growth has a very special mathematical definition, and it's when something grows in proportion to its current size. Okay, so we'll often hear in the news of something that's growing quickly, being described as exponential, or something that's very big being described as growing exponentially. But that's not what it means. It actually means when something grows in proportion to its current size. Actually, exponential growth can be very slow, at least initially. So this is a classic exponential curve. Time on the x-axis and the size of whatever quantity it's growing exponentially on the y-axis. And you can see actually initially not much seems to happen until suddenly it can take off quite quickly. And so sometimes this is called a J-shaped curve because it looks a bit like the letter J. So to convince you that exponential growth is not always big and not always fast, think about your bank account. Well, at least think about my bank account. Okay, the amount of money in your bank account might not be very big, and it might not seem to be growing very quickly, but it is growing exponentially because you get interest on the money in your bank account, and you get interest on the interest. You get interest on compound interest. Okay. That's a type of exponential growth because it is growing in proportion to its current size. And if you could leave it long enough, then boom, well, I need to be using the mouse, don't I? If you could leave it long enough, then it's going to take off. But of course, who can leave the money in their bank account long enough for it to do that, right? That's the problem. But it is growing exponentially. But yeah, I would never accuse the amount of money in my bank account of being big or growing very fast. But, you know, this is exponential growth. So why is exponential growth a problem? It's a type of nonlinear relationship. And it causes a problem because we have exponential growth bias. We tend to underestimate how quickly a process which is genuinely growing exponentially will grow and how big it will get into the future. Okay, so in my head, this is what our bias looks like. So this is what we think is going to happen, this dashed line. Okay, we're just predicting it's going to increase linearly. Okay, we have this bias. But actually what's really going to happen is, and again, I should be using the mouse probably, what's really going to happen is it's going to grow like this. And so exponential growth bias causes a number of problems. One of them is financial. Okay, so exponential growth bias makes saving for the future seem less attractive. Because actually you put some money away, and if you think that you're going to get this amount of money at the end, and actually you're going to get this amount of money, it makes it less attractive to save if you think you're only going to get this amount of money. Similarly, it makes taking on debt more attractive because if you think that your debt is going to cost this much in the future and actually it's going to cost this much, you would think more carefully about taking on that debt. Okay, and again, debt grows exponentially. If you don't pay off your credit card, you have to pay interest on the amount that you owe. Okay, and quite a large amount of interest on those credit cards, much larger than you would when you were saving. So there's been experimental evidence which suggests by surveying people that people with high levels of exponential growth bias who are worse at predicting exponential processes have higher debt to income ratios. They have more debt compared to their income. So that's bad news for us financially. By the same token, people with higher exponential growth bias are also less likely to take preventative measures when it comes to trying to prevent things like COVID, pandemics. People are less likely to wear masks, less likely to social distance, less likely to do all of those things because, again, they think what's going to happen is, well, it's just trundling along quite slowly. And we saw this with some of our leaders during the pandemic saying, well, we've only got a few cases. It's fine. It's all under control. And actually, it's growing exponentially. So although it seems to be growing quite slowly now, very soon it has the potential to get out of control. So you can see this happening in a variety of situations, but exponential growth bias is something that we all suffer from to a greater or less degree, but people with higher levels of exponential growth bias have more difficulties in reasoning and quantitative situations where exponential growth is playing. So that's a set of different types of nonlinear relationship, and there's many more in the book. But from this first part of the talk, I wanted to leave you with a few take-home messages before we move on to the second part. So firstly, we are predisposed to expect these linear relationships. Okay, we're taught from our earliest lessons in school that two variables will vary linearly. We're taught to expect that, but not every relationship is linear. In fact, some of the most important relationships that we meet, even on a day-to-day basis, like the money in our bank accounts, how it grows over time, these are non-linear relationships. So we need to be aware of these relationships and where they can come up. And so in particular, we should be looking out for things like exponential growth. We should be looking out for the square law, which governs the price of your pizza and how it varies with the diameter of the pizza. Cubic relationships, which are all about volumes. Feedback loops, both positive, like I've told you, but you also have negative feedback loops as well. Okay, so negative feedback loops often act to oppose the input that you give them. I call them the boomerang effect, because you throw a boomerang and it comes back and it hits you in the head, and that's what negative feedback loops can do if you're not careful. Okay, so There's lots more examples and stories in the book of where these things have affected real people's lives, hopefully to act as cautionary tales so they don't affect your lives. And then the second part of the talk is the other place where I think, one of the major places where we're not very good at interpreting this when we come across it in our everyday lives is randomness. So I'm going to argue that we're not very good at spotting randomness, but I'm also going to argue that we're not very good at being random either. Okay, so let's try this out then. So I've got 3 patterns here. They've all got 200 dots on them. And I'm going to ask you in a second to choose which one you think is the one that is generated using a computer to generate random numbers. Okay, so let me just describe the process by which I generated one of these points, one of these figures. For each point for the computer generated one, I would choose a position between 0 and 1, so between the left end and the right end of the plot for the x coordinate of that point. And I would do the same thing, a separate uniform random number, so equally likely to be anywhere between the top and the bottom for the y coordinate. And I would just repeat that process 200 times to make 200 points, which I would then place and draw on the plot. So that's the random pattern. And so what I'd like you to do is just, if you feel brave enough to show hands to see which one we think it is, then we'll see what our expectations of what randomness looks like really are. Okay, so I'm going to ask you one at a time, not one at a time. I'm going to ask the pictures one at a time, A, then B, then C. And then if you just put your hands up and I'll do a rough count. It won't be perfectly accurate. So who thinks that A is the randomly generated pattern? So I reckon about a third of people. Okay, good. What about B? Yes, possibly about the same. And C? Probably about the same, maybe slightly fewer for C, but a roughly even split for each 3. So 2/3 of you are going to be disappointed. Okay, so let me put some of you out of your misery then. So C is actually the nesting site of Patagonian seabirds. So these birds like to nest in a particular place, but it's not a very big place and there are a lot of them. Okay, so they have to be in quite close quarters. At the same token, though, they can see each other, and they don't like to be too close to each other when they build their nesting sites. They like to have a bit of space around themselves. So they make sure when they're nesting that they're relatively well spaced. And you can actually see that it's almost grid-like, right? You can see the triangles and the hexagons in here. It's a very, very, very regular space. It's filling the empty space quite evenly. And that's not what we expect from randomness. So we'll talk about it a bit more in a second. So which is the actual one? So it turns out that B is actually the nest sites of ants in a field. It's sort of the same deal with the ants. They don't like to be too close to each other in this field. But by the same token, they can't necessarily have the same overview that the birds have. So some of them do tend to build their nests a bit closer together than they might like. But actually, it's still more spaced. Or more evenly spaced out, if you like, than A, which is the genuinely randomly distributed pattern. So congratulations if you did go for A. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to choose which is the genuine one. And it's strange because we think of randomness as being evenly spaced out. In fact, when I was talking about generating the points, I said I generate the x coordinate, the horizontal position of each point, with equal probability along that axis and equal probability for the y coordinate. So why aren't they equally spaced? And why do we tend to choose B or C instead of choosing A? Well, if you chose B, it's possible that you might be suffering from something called middle bias. Okay, so middle biases are preponderance to choose the middlemost option out of a group of 3 or more when we genuinely don't know what the answer is. Okay, so we see middle bias in SATs, standard assessment tests, at schools. They do these in America. These are random multiple choice questions, but when the students genuinely don't know the answer, they tend to go for B and C with a higher probability than they do A and D. Just don't think that those 2 outer ones are that likely for some reason or other. We see it in this game Battleship. I don't know if you've ever played this, maybe with the kids, the grandkids, or yourselves. The game, if you haven't played it, you and your opponent each have a grid. You can't see each other's grids, and you get to put these ships down on the grid. So that's these red crosses in here. And then you take it in turns to guess a coordinate on each other's grid. And if you guess a coordinate where their ship is, they have to tell you, and you've hit their ship with a bomb. And it's the first person to bomb all of the ships wins. Now, it turns out when people are placing their ships in battleships, they tend to place them towards the middle with a higher proportion, with a higher frequency than they do towards the edges. And you might say, well, there are more middle squares than there are edge squares, and you'd be right. But even accounting for that, they still place their ships in the middle disproportionately often. So if you want to win battleships against the grandkids or the kids, then think about placing your ships towards the edge where people aren't guessing. That's maybe one way to do it. We also see middle bias in our children, apparently. And I used to tell this story and say, well, don't ask me how they found this out. But then, of course, people did come and ask me how they found this out. So I had to go back to the paper and read up on how they found this out. And it's quite clever, actually. So they didn't put a camera in there because that would be illegal, I think. And they didn't ask people when they were coming out of the toilet, do you mind? No, because that would just be really weird, wouldn't it? What they did was actually really clever. They spoke to the janitor or the caretaker and just asked them, how often do you refill the toilet rolls in each of these cubicles, and used that as a proxy for how often they were being used, which I think is a really smart piece of science. I like these sort of proxy measures where you can get at the answer without necessarily asking the question you think you have to ask. So apparently we exhibit middle bias in toilet cubicles. The other place where we might see this is maybe when we are choosing, I don't know, insurance, or choosing from different levels of packages online for house insurance, car insurance, holiday insurance, whatever it might be. And you might be faced with this situation where you've got the basic package, which is $699, $699, or the standard one, which is $880 or pounds, whatever it is. And actually looking at them, you're like, well, the basic one does all the things that I want it to do, and the standard one's got a couple more tips to it. But do I really need those? It's $180 more, so I'll probably just go for the basic package. But of course, we're never actually just faced with these two options, are we? Right? There's always the deluxe option, right, where it costs more than twice the standard option, right? It's ridiculously expensive. And you look at the deluxe option, you're like, whoa, that's so expensive. I'm not going to go for that one. It's only got 2 more tips than the standard one. The standard one looks good. I'll go for the standard one. I'm not going to go for the basic one. I'm not cheapskate. I'm going to go for the standard option, right? And you play these psychological games with stuff. And that the deluxe option is not there. No one ever buys the deluxe option. It's only there to make the standard option look more palatable, to give you this middle bias. So think when you're choosing these options, do I really need to go for the standard, or could I get away with the basic? Actually, if I ignored that deluxe one because it's ridiculous, could I get away with using the basic one? It's subtle psychological manipulation. Okay, so that's middle bias. That's maybe why we chose B. But why didn't we all just go for A, right? And the reason is that it doesn't feel very random. And the reason it doesn't feel very random is because when you look at it, there are clusters. There are clearly clusters. It's like someone's put the dots there next to each other. And there are also big, wide, open spaces where there aren't any dots at all. And that doesn't feel very random to us. It feels like things should be better spaced out than that if they're going to be genuinely random, right? But that's not how randomness works, unfortunately. Randomness does produce clusters, and it does produce empty spaces. And actually, we're just very good at spotting these, what we think of as patterns. And there's a sort of pseudo-evolutionary argument for why we're good at spotting these patterns, and it's that back in the day when we were a hunter-gatherer society, we might be out in the woods and hunting or gathering, and we would hear a rustle in the bushes behind us, and it could be a predator coming to eat us, so we run away and we live to fight another day and to pass on our paranoid genes to the next generation. It was probably just the wind behind us, but it could have been a wolf, and so we decide to run away and we pass on those genes, and we get good at spotting these patterns where actually it's just random. Similarly, it could be, there's a striped pattern on the bush over there, and it could be a tiger, so we run away, but actually it's probably just the sunlight coming through the trees in a stripy pattern. But we run away and we spot these patterns, and we got better at spotting patterns, and so we continue to pass on that ability of pattern spotting to future generations. So we're good at spotting patterns. Nowadays, instead of hunting and gathering, we do use it in a food context, this pattern spotting ability, but we use it often in spotting Jesus in pieces of toast, right? So you probably can't see it immediately, but if I zoom in, hopefully you can see now that there's a beardy bloke in this tortilla, right? It's not toast, it's a tortilla. And you can see I'll do it on the mouse as well. There's sort of the eye here and the nose and then lips there and a beard. And because it's a beardy bloke in a tortilla, you don't think it's me because you haven't met me yet. You will do now. But actually, you probably think, oh, it's Jesus. He's the most famous bearded bloke in the world. And maybe this is a message that's been visited on us from God. He's shown his son. I mean, for some reason, in the tortilla, he's decided to show the face of his son. And this is called pareidolia. So pareidolia is where we spot a pattern in a random audio or visual stimulus when there is no pattern there at all. Okay, so this is what we see. And when we make the next step, when we say, actually, I've not just spotted this pattern, but actually I think it's a sign from God, or I think it's something else, and that's called apophenia. Okay, so this is an example of apophenia. This is called the red face of Mars. Okay, this is a satellite image of the surface of Mars. Again, from our evolutionary past, it was very important for us to be able to spot faces, to interpret faces, and to see what that person who was approaching is, what their intent. So we're very good at spotting faces, and indeed, this does look like a face. Okay, and so people see this, what is effectively just a random pattern. I'll show you in a second, but they say, oh, it's a face, and that means God put it there, or it means aliens exist, or it means Martians, or it means, they jump to some unwarranted conclusion based on this pattern that they've seen. And actually, if you look at it's actually just a rock with sunlight shining on it from a particular direction. If you look at it more evenly lit, then this is what it looks like. It doesn't really look like a face anymore at all. So this is an example of apophenia, where we see this random signal, we interpret it as something that we recognize, we're good at spotting patterns, and then we jump to a conclusion based on that. It's a good story about this sort of apophenia, this pattern spotting phenomenon. I don't know if people recognize this device. It was briefly in existence between sort of 2000 and maybe 2007, 8. It's an iPod shuffle. It's designed by Apple. And this was actually at the time quite a revolutionary device. You could fit 10,000 songs on there, which was more than most people's music collection at the time. You could put them on, and then you could put your earphones in, and you could press play, and it would randomly shuffle through your songs so that you never got stuck in a rut listening to the same bands. You didn't have to think about how to choose it. It would just do it for you. It would just play your songs one after the other, randomly chosen. So it was quite a revolutionary device at the time. Now, there was a tech journalist, a guy called Stephen Levy, who was listening to his iPod Shuffle one day, and 2 songs by the same band, by Steely Dan, came up back to back. And he was in a fortunate position that he was actually interviewing Steve Jobs, who was the then CEO of Apple, the next week. So he took this question to Steve Jobs. He said, Steve, I think you've got a problem with the algorithm on your iPod Shuffle, because I had 2 songs by the same band playing back to back. That does not feel very random to me. And so Steve Jobs got an engineer on the phone and said, can you just check that we are genuinely randomly just picking the songs without replacements? You don't get the same one on the same day, but that there's no correlation between the way we're picking them. And the engineer said, yeah, of course, we're Apple, one of the biggest tech companies in the world. We don't make that sort of mistake. And so Steve Jobs told this to Stephen Levy and said, no, we are just genuinely picking these songs at random. But Stephen Levy didn't like this answer, because he was like, well, I don't think that could have happened at random. So he wrote this article, and hundreds of people wrote into him after reading the article saying, well, yeah, same thing happened to me. I had 2 Oasis songs played back to back, or I had three Bob Dylan songs played back to back to back. It can't possibly be random. And Steve Jobs, in response to this outrage, spoke to his engineers and said, please, could you change the algorithm so that 2 songs by the same band don't come up back to back. And as Steve Jobs described it, he said, we're making it less random to make it feel more random, to better conform to our expectations of what randomness is like. We don't think that clustering is random, but actually it really is. So I've argued that we're not very good at spotting randomness, and we're good at spotting patterns in randomness, which make us think that it's not random. And I'm also going to argue that we're not very good at being random. Okay, so I'm going to go to a website now, which is called the Cirencester Oracle. And hopefully, when I click on this, I need to do a little bit of, I don't want to do it on there. I need to do a little bit of wizardry where the screen sharing stopped. That's good. I need to do a bit of wizardry where I now share this so that people on Zoom can see it, and hopefully you can see it, and I'll make it full screen. Okay, so I need a volunteer to do a task for me. Before you volunteer, let me tell you what the task is. It's not going to be embarrassing or anything like that. We're going to do what the computer is asking us here. It says press the F and D keys, so just two keys that are next to each other on the keyboard, randomly as you can. And the computer says, I'm going to try and predict what key you're going to press next. So to give you the expectation, if you are able to be truly random at pressing these F and D keys, then the computer shouldn't be able to predict what you're going to do with an accuracy any higher than 50%. Okay, just guessing at random heads or tails each time, if you're able to be truly random. If it does better than 50%, then it's able to predict what you're doing, and you're not able to be completely random. Okay, so what will happen is when you start pressing the keys, you'll press it 5 times, and then it'll start making a prediction, and then it'll start showing that prediction. So red will be an incorrect prediction, and white will be a correct prediction. And then after 25 key presses, it will start outputting the percentage of times it's able to correctly predict what you're doing. So a number above 50% means you're not able to be random, and below you're able to be super random, if you like. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do. It's just we're going to do quite quickly because we haven't got loads of time. I'm just going to get you to press the F and D keys as randomly as you can. Does anyone fancy having a go for me? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Can you tell me your name?
Diana.
Diana, can we give Diana a round of applause, please? Thanks, Diana. So yeah, it's just the F and D keys. So whenever you're ready, we're going to try and do like 100 presses. Yeah, just keep going. And so yeah, whenever you're ready, just start, and then we'll start to see it spitting out predictions, and I'll try and talk everyone through. So whenever you're ready, please go for it. Okay, so it's predicting. White is a correct prediction, red is an incorrect prediction, and it's starting to output the percentage of time it's able to predict what Diana is doing here. So it's up at 73, 74%. So remember, 50% means that she's being able to be completely random. But the computer is able to predict at the moment what she's doing with a probability of 78, almost 80%. Let's keep going. Let's do like 10 more seconds. It's really, really difficult to be random, especially it's the first time you're doing it in front of a live audience. Okay, brilliant, Diana. Thank you so much for that. Thank you very much. Okay, so I need to then stop sharing this and go back to the presentation. Let's just find the presentation and full screen it, and then let's just get into Zoom and then share the presentation again, and hopefully everyone will be able to see that. And I need to run through a few slides, but that's okay. So what just happened? I made it difficult because I asked Diana to press the keys quite quickly, and it's harder to be random when we're pressing the keys very quickly. It's also hard for me to concentrate when I'm trying to press the keys quite quickly and talk to you. So Dan wasn't able to be random, and actually the first time I did this, it was hitting similar sorts of percentages, sort of 70%. It was able to predict what I was doing, and I thought, this is worrying. Is this somehow impinging on my free will? You know, is it able to predict what I'm going to do next? And actually, the algorithm it uses is not very complicated. It waits 5 goes to see what your first set of 5 key presses is, and then every set of 5 key presses after that in sequence, it just records what the sequence is. So F, F, D, D, F, 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 D, D, whatever it is. There's 32 different options because there's 5 key presses, and there's only 2 options for each one. So it's 2 to the 5, which is 32. So there's only 32 different options. And it just keeps a bar chart, if you like, a histogram of how often you've pressed each different key set. And then it looks at the 4 key presses, I'm a mathematician, 4 key presses that you've done before. And it just says, well, what's the next most likely one? Given those first 4 key presses, is it going to be F next or is it going to be D next? Just based on this histogram. And then it predicts that based on just learning a bit of data from you. So it's not artificial intelligence, it's not AI, it's not machine learning. It's a really, really simple algorithm. And the reason it's able to do that is because we're not very good at being random, right? We think FD, 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 that's well spaced out. So maybe that's random, but of course we know that that's quite predictable, right? We know that FD, 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 we'll be able to predict that quickly, right? So we throw in 2 Fs and 2 Ds, or maybe even 3 Fs and 3 Ds. What we don't do is putting 5 Fs or 5 Ds in a row, because that doesn't feel very random. Consecutive numbers like that, or consecutive key presses, doesn't feel very random. But actually in 100 key presses, 95% of the time you do that experiment, you'd expect to see 5 Fs or 5 Ds coming up. 95% of the time you do the experiment. So actually, it's not as unlikely as we would think, but it doesn't feel very random to press F 5 times in a row. So we just don't do it. Okay, so we're not very good at being random. So we think of randomness as being evenly spaced, but we know that complete even spacing isn't random, because we'd be able to predict it as a pattern, right? But actually, oh, sorry, I'm showing the wrong view with you. Let's see. Let's 1 second. Let's just.
You were sharing the right one on Zoom.
Was I? Oh, that's strange. Not really sure what to do with that, Richard. Any suggestions, or maybe we just carry on like this and you can just see my notes?
Probably best. Anything we press is going to make it worse.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think the computer said no. Anyway, well, hopefully we can. Hopefully we can go. Maybe as long as it doesn't start playing the slides in a random sequence, then that's fine. Yeah. Let's try that. Let's maybe we just turn off presenter view, or maybe we just swap presenter view slightly. Okay. Hopefully that works. Yeah. Sure. Okay. So we're not very good at being random. We tried this alternating thing. We know that's not quite random, so we throw in a little bit of extra what we think of as random, but we're not random enough. We tend to exhibit middle bias as well. These are the things which stop us from being random. So to convince you that those really are the things that stop us from being random, let me tell you a story about the national lotteries. The national lottery started in the UK in 1994 in November. And by the time the 14th of January 1995 came around, we'd actually had about, I think it was the 13th draw, but the 11th and 12th draws, no one had won the jackpot. So we had a rollover, in fact, a double rollover. And the prize pot stood at £16.2 million. So people were very excited about this. I remember this. I was only about 10 years old. I couldn't play, but I remember this excitement that was literally gripping the nation. People were not literally gripping, obviously, it was metaphorically gripping the nation. And people were, people going out and buying tickets. And actually, 70 million tickets were sold for that draw, which is way more than the number of adults in the UK who were eligible to play. So people were buying multiple tickets. And some bright sparks even worked out that there are only 14 million different combinations. So if you bought all of the tickets, then you're going to win the jackpot. Difficult to do. And we'll see why that's not a very good idea in a second. But 70 million tickets were sold. So people were buying multiple tickets because they wanted to win this jackpot. And the numbers when they came out were 7, 17, 23, 32, 38, and 42. Seems pretty random, right? That's as far as we're concerned at being random. But what actually happened that night was that 133 people had those winning numbers on their tickets. Can you imagine the feeling? Thinking you won 16 million and then finally you had to share it with 133 people. It's still about £100,000, but don't get me wrong, someone wants to give me £100,000, I'm not going to turn it down. But when you think you won £16 million, it's a bit of a kick in the teeth. So why did 133 people choose these numbers? Well, this is what the playset used to look like when it was what's called a 6 from 49 draw. Okay, so you draw 6 numbers out of a possible 49. They were laid out like this. And so if I plot the numbers from the 14th of January draw in 1995, you will see exactly those traits that I described of why we're not very good at being random. Okay, so you can see middle bias straight away. They didn't use that column. They didn't use either of these two columns on the right hand side. So I should be using the mouse again. They didn't use either of these two columns on the right hand side or this column on the left. You can also see that it's sort of well spaced. We think of randomness as being well spaced. So there's a space and a number, space and a number, and a space, and so on. And also there's no consecutive numbers because we don't think of consecutive numbers as being very random. Okay, we don't think that should come up. But actually, in half of all national lottery draws, you'd expect 2 consecutive numbers to come up. Now, some people will also tell me, well, actually, any pick of numbers is just as likely as any other pick. And so people say, well, let's see one here. I know this, and so I play the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 because they're just as likely as any other set of numbers to come up. But of course, you have to disabuse them of this notion, because if they do play those numbers and they do come up, then they have to share the jackpot with 10,000 other smart hearted who are also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that week. So don't do that. Okay, so maybe this was just fluke and people happen to choose those numbers, but not because they're not good at being random. Well, let's see what happened on the 16th of March 1996. This time 53 people shared the jackpot, and these were their numbers. And again, you can see the same patterns coming out. You can see well-spaced numbers, number, space, number, number, space, number, space, number, space, number. You can see they didn't use either of the outer two columns. And again, they haven't used these consecutive numbers. So what I can't do is tell you how to pick the right numbers, right? Because they're all equally likely, all sets of numbers are equally likely to come out of the draw. But what I can do is suggest, if you are going to win the jackpot, how you can maximize your winnings, how you can share it with as few people as possible. Okay, so this is how you maximize your winnings. So if you play the national lottery on average, someone who plays the national lottery will get back 45p in the pound that they play. And we know that because that's the amount of 55p goes to good causes and profit, 45p goes back to the player. So on average, you get 45p per pound. If you use a random number generator like the lucky dip, this is an option, you can just go and get a lucky dip, then that increases to 55p in the pound. So it's not actually that wonderful to use the lucky dip. It's a bit better than just choosing your favorite numbers on average, but it's not perfect. What you really want to do is avoid popular sets of numbers. You want to avoid numbers that other people are choosing. How do you do that? What are the numbers that people are choosing? Well, they are choosing often birthdays and anniversaries. So you want to avoid the numbers 1 to 12 in particular, because that's the number of months in the year. You want to avoid the numbers 1 to 31. And you don't have to completely avoid them, but don't pick them with the same frequency as you would all of them, because 31 is the number of days in the month, the maximum number of days in a month. So avoid birthdays and anniversaries and other popular dates. The other thing that you can do is to pick consecutive numbers. People don't think that randomness involves consecutive numbers, but like I said, in half of all national lottery draws, 2 consecutive numbers come up. So don't worry about picking consecutive numbers. If you pick consecutive numbers, the chances are that other people aren't picking that set of numbers. And if you win the jackpot, you get to keep it for yourself. And don't shy away from the edges of the playslip. Don't exhibit this middle bias. Use the whole width of the playslip. So here's a set of numbers that you could pick. So you see, I've only used 2 numbers that are below 31 and only 1 that's below 12. I've used the whole width of the playslip, and I've chosen 2 consecutive numbers. Now, of course, you could use these numbers, but don't use these numbers because these are my numbers. Let's not share the prize between us. Okay, but this is a sort of sensible choice. It's biased towards the higher numbers and using the whole width of the playslip. Okay, so just to finish, I'm going to give you a couple of take-home messages from the whole talk. So the first part of the talk was all about nonlinear relationships. So remember that some of the most important relationships that we encounter are nonlinear, and we need to start expecting these nonlinear relationships. We've been drilled in with this idea of linearity, but actually it's not always helpful. This is one that I didn't really talk about so much, but it speaks to our ideas of pareidolia and apophenia, is that we see coincidences happening, we pick out this pattern, and we draw a conclusion based on that. We think that there must be some meaning behind it. And people say, Kit, you're ruining coincidences for us. Can't we just enjoy them without you ruining them with all your maths? And I'm like, yeah, of course we can. But for me, the magic of coincidences is not that they happen. Okay, there's this law in mathematics called the law of truly large numbers, which says that if you give things enough chances, even extremely unlikely things can happen. And the lottery is a perfect example of that, right? It's very unlikely for any one person to win the lottery, but if enough people buy tickets, then that probability increases dramatically. And, most people, someone wins the lottery. So with coincidences, again, it's not to ruin coincidences, but given enough opportunities, what we think of as coincidences will surely happen. You hear these great stories of people who are neighbours going on holiday around the world without telling each other, and then ending up sitting opposite each other in a cafe and sort of waving each other. And for me, the magic is it's not that that happened, because surely that must happen all the time with the huge number of people in the world. But actually, the fact that those people were sitting opposite each other and one of them wasn't facing the other way, right? These near misses. It's the fact that it's how we find out about these coincidences, the fact that we spotted them. For me, that's the real magic of coincidences. So don't jump to conclusions based on coincidences or apophenia or pareidolia. And finally, hopefully that I've demonstrated that we're A, not very good at spotting randomness, and B, not very good at being random ourselves. So I'll finish by saying that there are going to be but there are books outside. I'm going to sign some. So if you want to buy a book and read some of the stories in this book or in the first book, then please do come out and buy one and talk to me about stuff. I'll be happy to talk to you all. And I've got a bit of time for questions, I think, Michael. Yeah, brilliant. So please hit me with your questions when you're ready. Thanks.
There we are, first one.
Why do things always happen in threes then?
So this is it's a good question. So the question was, why do things always happen in threes? I'm repeating so that people on Zoom can hear. So it's partly psychological, right? We tend to spot things when they happen in threes. There's a phenomenon called the Baader-Meinhof principle, which is not quite the answer to your question, but it's related in the sense that the idea is that you hear about something for the first time, and then it crops up over and over again over the next few days or few weeks, and we tend to notice that and think it's an extraordinary coincidence. I've only just learned about this phenomena, and all of a sudden it's happening over and over again. And it's to do with our memory. It's called the salience effect, where things that have happened more recently stay in our mind. It happened to me with P.T. Barnum, who's a circus owner and right-wing politician to some extent in the United States. I'd come across him when I was researching for the book, because there's something called the Barnum effect that psychics use to try and thinkers make they know more than they do. But then I was watching a film with my kids called The Greatest Showman, and he's the main character in The Greatest Showman. So I saw him again, and it just seemed to keep coming up. Now, what I didn't realise at the time was actually I'd met P.T. Barnum several years before watching a film called The Gangs of New York. He was a character in that film as well, but I hadn't registered it. And that's the really interesting thing about the Baader-Meinhof effect, is that it comes up and it has to be salient enough for us to recognise it. And it's only when it happens in quick succession that we register that, that we remember that. And actually, if it happens a long distance apart, then we forget about it. So that's why things appear to happen in quick successions, because actually they're stored in our recent memory. They're salient, they're easy for us to access. Actually, I'd met P.T. Barnum before, but he hadn't made a big enough impression for him to register. So that's sort of why three in particular. So buses, for example, there is a good book by Rob Easterway, who's another maths communicator, and his book is called Why Do Buses Come in Threes? And he has a good argument in there, which is a bit too long to go into here, but he does talk about why buses going around a route and coming back on each other tend to come in threes when they bunch up on each other. And partly it's to do with, you know, the bus that comes quickly behind doesn't have to pick up any passengers, right? So the first one has to stop at the bus stop and wait. The other one sort of catches up, maybe it overtakes, but then you get two buses and trained to each other that are sort of leapfrogging each other, and they tend to catch up, and that can happen with a third one as well. So that's why buses tend to come in threes. Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks.
Recently, I read about Fibonacci sequences in my 10-year-old daughter's homework, maths homework,
Oh, great.
and I didn't really know about that before.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of the snail shell, isn't it, and sunflower seeds.
Yeah.
How does that happen in nature, that you have these mathematical sequences?
The Fibonacci is a brilliant example.
Could you just repeat?
Yeah, sorry, yes, of course. The question, sorry, yeah, good question. The good point. The question is about Fibonacci sequences and how these come up all over the place, seemingly. And so the Fibonacci sequence, for people that don't know, it's a sequence where you take two numbers and you add them together to get the next number in the sequence. So you start with 1 and 1, you add them together to get 2. And then you add 1 and 2, and you add them together and you get 3. Then you add 2 and 3, and you get 5. Then you add 3 and 5, and you get 8, and then it's 13 and 21, and so on. Okay, so this Fibonacci sequence, it's growing actually exponentially in the large number limit. So why does it appear to come up everywhere? Well, we need to be a little bit careful about this. I like to use Fibonacci because it does appear in sunflower heads, but the snail shell thing is actually a bit of numerology, actually. Like, really, if it was a Fibonacci sequence, the snail shell should be a logarithmic spiral. Okay, so a spiral which is growing exponentially in radius as you go round and round. But actually, most shells, nautilus shells, snail shells, are not actually this the spiral of the golden ratio, which is associated with Fibonacci. So some of it is numerology, and actually I wrote an article for BBC Sport, because I don't know if people are aware of this, but this year the number of the teams that have won the Premier League, because Liverpool just won their second Premier League, not league title overall, but if you order the teams by the number of titles that they've won, it goes 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. Okay, so it's the Fibonacci sequence, and I was like, when I saw this, I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. But then I thought about it, it was like, there's no actual mechanism by which that could possibly have come up. So actually, it's just me spotting a pattern where there isn't a pattern. So you have to be super careful that sometimes spotting these coincidences can be brilliant for science, because we spot a connection we didn't expect. We have to investigate it, and that's great. Sometimes, though, it is just coincidence. I like to call it. Sometimes it just happens. But Fibonacci do generally come up in nature. So there's nice arguments for why it happens in sunflowers, about in particular about like petal structures, because the golden ratio, the golden ratio is an angle which is, or the golden angle is an angle associated with the Fibonacci numbers. And if you put your leaves around the stem in those particular angles, then you maximize the amount of sunlight that you can achieve. Then they're not overlapping with each other too much. So that's quite a nice one. But you see it in bee family trees and in rabbit family trees. If you think about the generations of different animals, you start with one, and then you start with one, and then one in the first generation, when they breed with two, and then they create a third one, and the Fibonacci sequence can come out of that. So it does definitely come up in nature, but less often than people like to pretend it comes up. It's not this magical formula that appears everywhere, but it does come up.
Questions?
Instead of playing the lottery,
yeah,
have you calculated the chances of marrying a millionaire?
So the question was about marrying a millionaire. Depends how, I suppose it depends how smooth you are, doesn't it? Right? Unfortunately, I'm already married, and she's not a millionaire. So I would have to go through an expensive divorce process, which should be a bit risky and probably not in my best interest for many other reasons. Chances of, the actual mathematical chances of marrying a millionaire. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things to say about that. So when we build a mathematical model, which is effectively what you're asking for, we have to put in a bunch of assumptions. And so one assumption might be you're equally likely to marry any woman or man in the whole of the population. And so then you might just have to figure out how many millionaires there are, and that would be your model, and it'll tell you how likely you are to marry a millionaire. But it's not a very good model, right? Because you're not equally likely to marry everyone in the population. So you have to build a more complicated model and put in details into those models, lots of assumptions. The problem with mathematical models is that they're always simplifications of reality. So there's always sort of holes that you can pick in them. We used a lot of mathematical models during COVID, for example, and people dismissed a lot of the mathematical modelling that went on because they said, well, it's just a model, it's not reality. And that's not, I mean, it's fine to pick holes with models if you disagree with the assumptions that are in those models, but it's not okay just to say, well, it's a model, it's not reality. And if the assumptions are good enough in that model, then it will predict reality to a good degree. So good modelers will make the assumptions that go into their models clear when they're building that model, so that people who want to scrutinize the model can say, well, actually, I don't agree with your transmissibility estimate, or I don't agree with your prediction of the the eligibility of these millionaire women, and so people can scrutinize these models. So yeah, we have to be a bit careful when using models. Lots of people do try and use maths for love. Lots of mathematicians anyway. There is a nice problem which I deal with in the first book, in the Maths of Life and Death, which is called the optimal stopping problem. And it's also sometimes called the secretary problem. I won't go into all the detail, but the idea is that you have to, in the original formulation of the problem, you have to hire someone for a job. But the kicker is that you interview them, and you have to tell them whether they've got a job immediately, or you have to then just discard them from the pile. And so the question is, how long should you go? What strategy should you use to hire people? And it turns out the best thing to do is to look at the first 37 candidates to get a proxy or a gauge of the quality of what's out there, and then hire the best person that comes after the 37th, who's better than all the rest that you've already seen. That's the way it works. And so people allegedly use this for dating, and say, well, I'm 20 now, and I've got you know, I can date one person a year for the next 20 years. So I've got 20 people. So I need to see the first 37% of those. So however many that is, 7 people, and then I'll choose the best. Obviously, you can't, you know, it's maths the heart. You can't be discarding people you're happy with just because you're using an algorithm. But people have proposed this as a dating strategy, whether they're millionaires or not. Good question. Yeah, please.
Different question, but
Yep.
have you ever won the lottery?
So the question was, have I ever won the lottery? I don't tend to play. I was sort of joking about those numbers. They're not really mine. Partly because I know, you know, the expected winnings are very low. We do the OMAs, you know, when you can win a house thing, just because it's a bit of hope. But I wouldn't discourage people from playing the lottery, but I would say, you know, only play to the extent that you can afford it. As with any gambling, it can be fun, right? It can be entertaining. But as long as you recognise that you're doing it for entertainment value and not actually to get yourself out of a financial black hole because you've got exponential growth bias, then that's fine. As long as you're doing it, you know, with the money you can afford, then I don't want to ruin the lottery for people. But I don't tend to play myself.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk.
Oh, thanks.
I just wonder what you think the best way of inspiring children with numbers and maths is.
Yeah, I don't think it's specific to kids, but I think it's for everyone, is showing people where maths and numbers can come up and impact their everyday life. And that's really why I wrote both of these books, is because I wanted to tell the stories of real people who have been impacted by mathematics. So in the Maths of Life and Death, there's chapters on justice where people have been sent to prison because of misunderstandings of mathematics, that, you know, the judge or the lawyers didn't get it right, or people have been given false positive diagnoses or false negative diagnoses because the doctors didn't understand the mathematics. Yeah, there's all sorts of stories of people being given the incorrect dose of medicine because they got the decimal point in the wrong place. They got 10 times as much insulin as they should have had. So this idea of telling people where maths can have an impact and giving people, I would never argue that everyone has to have a degree in maths or even has to do maths at A level, but giving people these small sort of tips and tricks and hints and hacks that they can use in their everyday lives to spot places where they might make mistakes, or to avoid traps, or to optimize their life. You know, to find the best restaurant, you can use that optimal stopping strategy. You think you're going to see 10 restaurants, check out the first 3, and then choose the best one after that, and that 37% of the time gives you the best option that you're going to see. So yeah, I think using maths in the real world and showing how it can work is really important to inspire everyone to do it.
Well, I think we've got to draw that to a conclusion. It's been a great talk, Kit. Thanks very much indeed. And remember to go and look at the books outside and part with some of your money.